I walked down that aisle knowing I was buying time. It is a small confession to begin with, and I have learned that confessions sit better when they are short and precise, like a receipt folded in the pocket. The church that morning smelled not only of lilies but of calculation. The flowers had been chosen to look effortlessly abundant, their stems hidden behind silver wire so that nothing appeared as work. She moved as if she had always been part of that ease, the hem of her dress avoiding the marble in a way that suggested practice, the slight tilt of her head arranged so that cameras found her angle and lingered. People smiled at us the way you smile at a well-made promise. My mother watched from the front row as if she had been paid in whole, as if every line on her face were a ledger balanced. There were reasons that could be summed and subtotals made of my mother's debts, the solicitor's neat pen marks, the cousin who had started to call less and then more, mentioning names I had already learned to avoid. I had, in the year before the wedding, become someone who counted months the way other men counted cigarettes. She had been offered by the city's gentle accelerants, society pages, charity committees, the cough of conversation that loved to say someone belonged. I had been offered by obligation. The ceremony itself felt like an exchange, the vows a ledger entry made aloud. I knew the exchange, and I consented. Still, contracts can be softer than paper. We signed beneath a chandelier that kept its cool, and when we walked between the rows afterward, people made room in a way that made me feel, briefly, that I could breathe. The breath was measured. I learned her public self first. The socialite who rearranged a room without appearing to touch it, who had a laugh that never hesitated, and a face that was designed to be a good photograph. She observed things the way a curator observes artifacts, removing nothing, cataloging detail. At dinner, she could say which painter favored a certain blue, and how that blue made the sitter look younger, and men meant the compliment as tribute. But it was in the house that the transaction began to unfurl into something else. After the signing, after the parties, after the endless small formalities, we moved into the old estate that belonged nominally to her family. They called it an estate the way some call loneliness a company. It had rooms large enough to hold a memory. There was a reflecting pool in the courtyard, an incongruous sheet of stillness framed by limestone and clipped boxwood. The first time I saw it, it lay like a thought that had not yet chosen the correct words. Its surface was a perfect, strange mirror. The stars fell into it and stayed, so that on a clear night I could see my own face as if it were a coin held at the bottom of someone's hand. At home, the world rearranged itself into smaller mercies. We developed micro-rituals that felt like vows in miniature. The way she insisted her tea be left steeping for precisely 3 minutes and 30 seconds, then cooled by the space of a single breath. The way I folded her evening newspaper exactly in half, spine out, so she could find the crossword without having to shift the lamp. She taught me the names of cushions, an absurd thing to teach and a necessary one, and I learned to hang her coats in the hall the way she liked, shoulder pressed back, collar turned. I learned, too, to see the world in the terms that matter to someone who observes, the slight drift of dust in late afternoon, the manner in which candle flames lean toward the person speaking like saplings. These domesticities were not things of dramatic ardor. They were small and stubborn, like nails driven into a frame. There was tenderness in them, gentle, almost accidental. We married as two parties had met, and somewhere in the months that followed, transaction softened into the strange, reluctant thing that looks like affection. I found myself standing at the sink, drying a cup she had used, feeling a satisfaction I could not flatly name. There was a comfort in being required. It kept me tethered to a person who, at first, had seemed made to be admired rather than to admire back. She remained, however, always slightly apart. Her eyes often lingered at the edge of things, cataloging gestures and aligning them to a standard only she could see. She was spectacular and reserved in the same breath. The combination made her unassailable. When she laughed aloud, it was a clear, surgical thing. When she listened, it was like someone collecting evidence. I sometimes imagined her as an audience of one, and myself the performer whose lines had been improved by her approval. There were oddities, small ones at first, the kind you name and shelve away because you are busy with the work of mornings. The reflection in the foyer mirror delayed by a single, almost imperceptible moment when she moved her hand, so that I sometimes caught the image of her fingers straightening a necklace a hair's breadth after she had actually touched it. A spoon left in the sink showed a delayed echo of the room, a fainter room that seemed to answer the real room a split second later. I would notice the lag and attribute it to bad glass or tiredness, perhaps to my own wish to see things as other than they were. It was in those cautiously observed details that my affection deepened. Tenderness often arrives because a person teaches you to notice particularities you did not know you valued, the place where the fabric of a sleeve gathers when one reaches for a book, the exact tone of voice used when she asked if I had slept well. These are the arithmetic of love avoided by grand gestures. They are ledger entries in a warm account book. Outside, the city continued to perform the myth. At the club, acquaintances would nod and say that she had been especially luminous that week. At charity events, she would glide among donors and return with hours cut out of the afternoon. Their eyes would stop at me and slide as if over a photograph. In such moments, I would remember the reasons we had married and feel briefly and precisely what they call gratitude, an emotion that is mostly an admission of private relief. I told myself, sometimes at midnight, that we had both secured advantages in a market that did not forgive slowness. But gratitude is a nuance. It can feel, when named aloud, like a polite lie. There is a delicate currency to the private life of people who have made a public bargain. We made small purchases to keep the illusion of a settled household, a pair of candlesticks for the mantel, a wool blanket for winter that smelled faintly of wool and sea salt. Candles in the parlor leaned as if to listen. The flames grew slightly sickle-shaped, inclined toward the person speaking as though the wax itself were susceptible to conversation. The house answered to us like a living instrument. It retained echoes of our footsteps, the way a stringed instrument remembers the pressure of a bow. At night, when the town's lamps went out like tired hearts, we would sit near the reflecting pool with a single lamp between us and read aloud from books chosen with the same fastidiousness with which she had chosen the lilies. We read poetry more often than we read news. I found that she listened less to the meaning of lines than to the way syllables arranged themselves, like an artisan appraising the joinery of a well-made sentence. She corrected me once gently when I misread a name. The correction was not pedantic, but offered as the placement of the last brick in a small private edifice. There was a slow lag to her reflection that I learned to read the way one reads a face after an absence. It was not always present, and it was never loud. It arrived most commonly when we were sitting with the lamp between us and the pool behind, the night air moving its surface into a honeycomb of starlight. At such times I would see her image in the pool and realize then that it was responding to her a hair's breadth too late. She would tilt her head, and the water would tilt a fraction afterward, as if the pool were pondering whether to follow. When I mentioned it, she would smile and say, "Water is obstinate." She never made a fuss of the delay. She treated it as an interesting thing to note, like the provenance of a certain willow. Her treatment of oddities was always aesthetic. She did not seem troubled, she catalogued. There came, slowly, a change in her pattern of seeing. The social distance softened by degrees into something that looked suspiciously like care. Where once she had been all observation and little touch, she began, with the sort of small courage it takes to alter habit, to reach. She learned the right pressure to put on the cup when handing it to me so my fingers would not burn, how to tilt a plate so the gravy pooled correctly on the side. She once straightened the collar on my shirt in a public room with a quick, deft thumb, and I felt a tenderness so sharp it made me dizzy. These were ineffable acts, the removal of a pebble, the mending of a torn seam. Human things. My mother, who had been watching from the beginning as a ledger watches a figure, softened her own complaints into a quieter gratitude. "She is good for you," she said once, as if pronouncing the closing of a contract. There was no malice in it. There was simply the economy of someone who had been rescued. Still, I carried suspicions like small stones in my pockets. They were the residue of older selves. A man who had married to settle debts does not lose his caution at once. When a neighbor remarked that we were the model of a new kind of pairing, I felt both pride and a blade of defensiveness. Sometimes late, I would stand by the pool and watch myself there. The reflection, if the light was right, cast me with an odd detachment, as if it questioned whether I had become someone else. Perhaps it was only tired eyes. Perhaps it was a man inventing narrative. There was an evening when the first real fissure of unease crept into our domestic life. I remember it because the details lined up like an inventory. It was raining, late autumn rain that made the limestone smell like iron. We had dinner with 2 guests, people from a charity committee who spoke in measured bursts, and the house was pleasantly loud with conversation. The candlesticks on the table leaned as if to listen, and threw shadows that moved like slow ink across the walls. After they left, she suggested we have tea in the library. I agreed, and I will admit freely that I was startled when I found her there with the kettle already on. She had a way of being one step ahead that used to annoy me. It now comforted because it meant she had anticipated the kind of small domestic moves that used to be mine. She poured my tea and then, watching the surface, lowered her own cup to her lips and froze for just a second. Her hand, mid-air, held a small tremor. "Do you see that?" she asked. I thought she meant the tremor. Instead, she pointed, delicately, across the room to the tall mirror that leaned against the wall. In it, our reflections moved together, but a hair's breadth out of sync. I had taken a breath. My image took it in the mirror 1 beat later. Her lips had shaped a question, and her reflection's mouth had followed like punctuation, left a few words behind. "Water again," she said, with the same steady voice she used to correct my pronunciation. "Or glass." "It may be the fever," I said, and I thought of fevers because that was the only bodily explanation I could conceive. It was an answer that satisfied no one, least of all me. She smiled, not unkindly. She turned and smoothed her dress the way one smooths a map to find a route. After that night, I began to notice the small wrongnesses more closely. Clothes did not sit upon the chair in our bedroom the way I had left them. A sleeve seemed to have moved as if another hand had checked for spots. The kettle would be set on the back of the stove when I knew I had left it beside the sink. Little things misaligned. Once the crossword in the morning paper had a square filled in with a looping hand that was not mine, the word fit, and yet the shape of the letters threw me into a mild suspicion. These were not, on their own, emergencies. They were the kinds of anomalies that men in old stories notice with an odd combination of curiosity and dread. I began, without quite deciding to keep a small list. It was a private catalog tucked in the back of a notebook where I traced the minutes of our domesticity as if charting a small town. It contained entries like tea, cooled by a minute, and spoon echo, 0.3's delay, and mirror, lag, observed 2x. The ledger voice within me found refuge in the accounting of the unusual. By measuring the oddness, I could maintain an illusion of control. My entries were not meant for anyone else. They were, in truth, my way of making the house legible. There were still, of course, evenings of pure ordinariness. We argued once about a painting I wanted to hang in the corridor. Too heavy, she said, not right for the light, and we compromised like people who have spent long in negotiation. I would bring in boxes from the attic and she would arrange their contents, the parcel paper becoming a small set design for our lives. Our physical togetherness itself became a ritual of practice, imperfect, but continuous. She taught me how to fold the fitted sheets without losing the corners. I taught her to whistle a tune she could not quite hold. We were, for a while, 2 people learning the same language. At times, I think the house itself learned us. It developed a grammar of smallness, the careful placement of keys, the way shoes were aligned, the habitual location of umbrellas. The reflecting pool became, for me, the most honest mirror of all. In it, I could see things as if they had been held for inspection. Sometimes I would stand at the edge and watch the ripple of my own reflection when I stepped back, and the little delay in the water's answering would feel like a question posed by the world waiting for me to speak. There were moments of near hysteria that I fortunately reserved for my pen. Once I discovered the biscuit tin open with the lid left ajar, though we had closed it together the night before. Once I found a note slipped into my jacket pocket, a short, handwritten sentence that read like a quotation, though I had not seen anyone slip it there. The handwriting, when compared to our usual sample, had the same slanted accuracy that I saw in her signature, and yet something about the curl of the G suggested a practiced mimicry, a version of her hand taught to behave like hers. When I raised these things, she would answer with a stillness and an aesthetic anecdote. "Things pile themselves for reasons we do not know," she would say, and then proceed to describe, with delight, the provenance of some plate. She never seemed frightened. Her composure was not the false invulnerability I had imagined before we married. It was steadier, like someone who had long since learned to make solitude bearable. I valued that steadiness. It kept the house from tipping into melodrama. The city, meanwhile, noticed other things and not those that concerned me. At a benefit the following winter, I watched her move among people and gather little confidences the way a hand gathers the last of a scarf into a pocket. Her laugh, always precise, now carried an undertone of something private, an experience of affection that did not need to be performed. I felt in those hours that the bargain had in part become surplus to our needs. We had acquired a private language, and yet the lag persisted. Occasionally there would be a mirror in which her image would be a hair slow. Sometimes the silvered surface of a photograph would hold back an expression as if unwilling to betray the subject's intent. I found myself beginning to read these hesitations the way one reads a map with slight tears, the marks signifying places to avoid, places to explore. I also found myself increasingly feeling protective, as if the lag were a small injury. The inclination to protect, to put oneself between a woman and a discomfort, is not always magnanimous. It is often the raw calculus of someone who knows what he will lose if the world shifts. The first real test of our tenderness was not theatrical. It arrived by way of something we have all known, illness, small and domestic. She came down with the flu that February, a simple thing by most standards, but she was immovable in her composure, and I was awkward in my ministrations. I made a broth and watched it cool in the kettle, and I learned that the tilt of the lamp had to be perfect for her to read without squinting. The candles leaned as if curious about our quiet. When she slept, sweat gathering at her hairline, her mouth slightly open, I felt the most animal part of myself, fear for the fragile, miles from any public audience. It was in those long nights that the lag changed its character. When she rose to fetch water in the middle of the night, I remember seeing her silhouette cut against the moonlit pool. Her reflection followed after, as always. But for the first time, I noticed that the delay was not merely temporal. There was an elegiac quality to it, as if the world recognized emotion and then, with a reverence or reluctance, consented to copy it. I stood at the window watching until the chill found me, and I drew my coat over my pajamas. "Do you ever think," she asked once, holding the cup between both hands as if it were a small altar, "that the world is a little too obedient to our expectations?" I am careful with metaphors. They tend to do the work of people who would otherwise have to hurt. "I think it's obedient enough," I replied. "Obedience has value." She did not laugh. The lean of her candle flame seemed to deepen. "Obedience can be exhausting," she said. There were nights when I tried to catch the lag and find its cause. I put a hand mirror near the pool and watched, instructing myself to be practical. There was a subtle dilation at the edge of the water where a ripple seemed to hesitate before moving, a small social ritual of the elements. I made notes that were a combination of science and superstition. Time of night, barometric pressure, whether she had read aloud that day. The ledger filled with small, dedicated obsessions. People say that living with an observer is like living with a clock that tells you the wrong hour. You can adjust, but your life is measured against an instrument that refuses to be reconciled. Yet she also learned to touch. On another evening, ordinary enough to be dangerous, she came into the sitting room and sat so close that our thighs brushed. She reached across, almost shyly, and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. It was the most human thing she had done, and I felt, in the place beneath my breastbone, as if something uncoiled. "You're being sentimental," she said, almost amused at herself. "And you look ridiculous when you pretend not to be." "Sentimentalism comes with the territory," I answered. "When one is saving time, sentiment occurs as an unplanned expense." We laughed then, small, private laughter. The house agreed by tilting its windows toward the sounds. At some point in those months, I began to understand that intimacy is an apprenticeship in failure. You teach your hands where to go, and you are often wrong. The first time she pressed the top of my head with a hand, as if checking for fever, and then recoiled as if she had found a memory not meant for her, I understood the cost of reaching. The cost is to be touched back in a way that may not fit the precise contours of your expectation. It is to be misread and loved nonetheless. I found myself inviting the misreading, pressing small foolishnesses into the evenings as if to see whether she would answer them with tenderness. She did. The little wrongnesses did not go away. In fact, they became more precise. I began to notice, in the way she made coffee, a slight delay in the pour. The stream would hesitate above the cup as if considering the trajectory. She would sometimes pause mid-sentence as if listening to a voice only she could hear. Her hands, when occupied, moved with the accuracy of someone practicing a role. And yet the warmth that followed those actions was not counterfeit. When I scraped my knee, removing the last of the winter's slush from the hallway, she came and kissed the bruise, the touch brief and sanctioned, and I wanted to embarrass myself by offering gratitude, but I simply said, "Thank you," like someone giving a dinner party. There was an evening I returned to often in my head, when the house, the pool, the leaning candles, and the ledger all seemed to conspire into a single sentence. It was late, the kind of late that tastes like china and nothing. We had been silent for a while, reading our separate books. I set mine down and watched her read for a moment longer, imagining that I could record the small inhalations as a kind of metric. In the mirror above the mantel, her reflection moved a breath behind. The pool answered the world a beat later. She closed her book, ran a finger along the spine, and looked up at me. "You keep that notebook," she said. "Yes." She tilted her head in what I had come to understand as her thinking posture. "May I see?" I hesitated. There are private inventories that protect us from the imagination. I had written odd things in that notebook, not all of them flattering. It contained measures and suspicions, but also the names of the things I loved. The particular callus on my thumb, the way sunlight caught the dust motes at 3 in the afternoon. To give someone that catalog is to trust them to interpret both your calculations and your tender enumerations. She reached for the book and I handed it to her. She opened it gently, as if feeling for the presence of a person in the paper. She read a few lines and then, without comment, looked at me again. "You're measuring us," she said. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I'm securing the account." She smiled then, a small private thing. "What would you do," she asked, "if the account went missing?" I wanted to say something clever and practical. I would find it, I would add entries, I would write footnotes. Instead, I answered honestly, because sometimes honesty is a small currency one spends in a large room. "I suppose I'd miss it," I said. "Would you remember the things in it without the paper?" she asked. My answer took longer than it should have. Memory is, in many ways, the same as faith. You cannot measure what you are about to lose, only the absence it will make. "I hope so," I said. She closed the book, placed it on her lap as if it were a small animal, and laid her hand over it. Outside, the wind moved the trees, and the pool kept its particular star-struck watch. The candle on the mantel leaned nearer, and the flames, collecting in their private congregation, seemed more intent upon us than on the room. There is a certain ordinance of life that insists one cannot be both forensic and tender simultaneously. I have found that to be false. You can catalog with one hand, and with the other lift a cup to another's lips. I cataloged so that I could love. The habit of counting is an act of faith for those who fear the erosion of things. The tally keeps the edges sharp so that the shape of a life does not blur. But I also found that the more I counted, the more I feared the ledger itself might be ephemeral. It was in the hush that followed this private commerce, after the book had been closed, candles leaning, pool holding sky, that I felt the first deep disquiet, the slow realization that a house can hold its own opinions about the people who live in it. The rooms, in their own time, began to behave as if they were rehearsing for a change. The curtains would not fall precisely where you expected. The hour on the grandfather clock would lag by half a minute, as if remembering that it had been wound. The reflection in the pool would be, for a moment, perfect, and then it would answer our motions a fragment too late. I put my hand into my pocket and found, by chance, the small coin I had kept since before the marriage, a private token of bargaining and of the kind of man who keeps nothing to no use. I rolled it between my fingers and felt its coolness as if I were balancing two currencies, the practical and the tender. She watched me with the concentration of someone cataloging a specimen. Then she reached out and with that small, decisive finger, tapped the coin as if to test whether it was real. "You're not the kind to be replaced by the wind," she said. I smiled and told myself that it was humor, and perhaps it was. I wanted to trust the whimsy of the sentence and to set aside the uneasy thought that it resembled prophecy. If one were to tell this story in a single breath, one might say that everything that followed grew out of that late, careful hour by the pool when the candles leaned and the notebook lay closed beneath her hand. I will not say more now than that parts of my house began to take their own counsel. The lagging reflections became a language I was learning to translate. The small errors in our domestic practice took on texture, like a seam failing in a dress you thought well made. I began to keep watch not in order to defeat the unknown, but because I wanted to understand whether the thing I had cultivated with such care could be altered without my consent. If you like slow-burn mysteries, stay with me. The week after I began to keep the list in earnest, the small wrongnesses multiplied as if they were a single, persistent irritant that only needed rubbing to draw blood. They were never dramatic, no missing persons posters, no smashed glass, but precise, bureaucratic errors that accumulated into something larger than the sum of their petty betrayals. A glove left on the sill not in its mate but folded, like an apology. A page torn from the calendar with no day circled. The whiskey decanter moved a half-inch toward the lamp, so its label caught the light differently. Each was a punctuation mark in a sentence whose meaning I could not quite parse. There was a Thursday in late March when the lag took a shape I could not explain away as tired eyes or old glass. We had guests coming for soup from the next parish, two couples who kept their conversation respectable and their wine recommendations reliable. I went out to the courtyard to fetch a tray, and the sky, for a brief instant, looked like the interior of a seal's eye, glossy, black, uncompromising. The reflecting pool lay there, rimmed in limestone, its surface unnervingly still. I remember looking down at my reflection and thinking, with that peculiar mix of humor and dread men sometimes use to make life bearable, that the pool was a map that had misplaced its legend. I had the tray balanced, a teapot steaming, when I noticed that the reflection at the pool's edge did not match my weight distribution. The man in the water bore his shoulders with the sort of small adult shrug you see in photographs of people pretending not to notice a camera. He raised his hand to steady himself against a breeze that did not exist. I blinked, and when I blinked the motion in the water continued as if on a loop. The image was fractionally behind, not in tempo, but in presence. I set the tray down on the flagstones and reached for the pocket of my coat to check the coin I carried. My hand came away empty. The tray, I realized, had been set precariously. It rocked, and the teapot sloshed. Before I could steady it, something in the air changed. The lamp in the loggia guttered as if an argument had passed between it and the world. For an instant, the candles in the parlor leaned away from the doorway as if shielding themselves. The courtyard felt narrower, as if someone had drawn a line and asked us to stand within it. When I turned to go back in, I had the uncanny sensation of two doors, the one I stood before and the one my life might have been. I crossed a threshold with the tray in my hands, and the world contracted to wax and steam and the small, bright sound of porcelain. Inside, the room was arranged as always. The chairs held the shape of their recent occupants. The soup ladle sat waiting like a sentinel. No one remarked on my lateness. My mother, bless her, lifted a hand and smiled at me as if I were a photograph come to life. Dinner took place in its ordinary choreography. I moved plates, refilled glasses, kept conversation light. I watched her watch the light in the oil lamp pool around the room. She seemed less detached than she had in years, a quality I had learned to cherish without naming it. We spoke of trivialities. At one point, as the soup cooled a fraction too quickly, I placed my hand on the back of my chair and felt a prickling at the base of my skull, like an animal twitching to find its lost path. It was after the guests left, after the house closed its polite mouth and the candlesticks leaned forward again, that I noticed my coat was not where I had left it. The hallway held itself as if it had been expecting a thief. The hooks were populated by other garments, but not mine. I told myself I had simply misplaced it in a small domestic rotation. Perhaps I had left it draped over the banister or tucked into my study. I checked the study, then the guest room, then the attic, rooms long enough to hold a memory, and found only the soft evidence of life, a scattering of dust, the faint curl of newspaper edges, a shoe that had lost its mate. The notebook consequentially made a small protest in its absence. I keep it beside the armchair, the leather softened by the pressure of my thumb. When it was not there, I felt for the first time a stripe of rawness cross the tenderness we had built. I walked through the house with the keen, practical anger of a man who understands where his things belong. When I reached the bathroom on the east wing, I stopped because the smell of steam carried with it a distinct and familiar note. Aftershave. Not mine, not hers, but the one I had worn before I married, a cheap cologne that used to accompany me to bad kitchens and better bar rooms. The scent should have been a comfort. It registered instead as an unearned attendance. I returned to the parlor and found a chair in my stead. The chair was warm. The newspaper lay across the arm as if folded following my routine. A book, open to a certain page, had my spectacles perched on it. There were, in short, things that claimed me. Then there was absence. An empty cufflink box on the mantel that usually contained the pair I used for Sunday. A single cufflink lay under a lamp, round and apologetic. At the very moment I told myself I would not be silly, one leaves a coat, one misplaces a notebook, the house altered its grammar. The pool shivered and, in that slow motion that has its own law, cast up a face that was not exactly mine. It wore my mouth, my hands, the tilting habitualness of my hat when I carried wood. But there was something else. The face did not carry the small, habitual mistakes that constitute a life. It wore gestures like clothes fitted with pins. I called her name because that is what one does in houses one assumes are safe. She answered from the library with a minute warmth that told me she was there and not panicked. When she entered the room, carrying a small parcel of new matches, I saw her watch me in the way that had first taught me to believe there might be tenderness for me. And then, as she rounded the table, she paused, as if noting a detail in a painting with the same diction one uses to describe a shade of blue. "You're quiet," she said. "I misplaced something," I replied. "My coat, the notebook." She did not look surprised. She set the matches down with an exactitude that made me want to confess something larger than the missing objects. "Perhaps," she said, "someone has taken to leaving you in new places." There are moments when a sentence functions like a hinge. Hers was one. It allowed me briefly to swing into anger, practical and loud, or else to sit down and let the quiet do its work. I chose to sit. The ledger part of my mind, my father's mantras of accounts balanced and debt square, tried to calculate all of it. Who had the motive to remove my belongings? What might be gained? People like us did not suffer thefts that were petty. Thefts here had an elegance, a motive that concerned image rather than goods. I told her I would walk to the town and back, that perhaps a walk would reorder my head. She extended the sleeve of her coat to me in a reflexive domestic gesture. "Take this," she said. Her fingers brushed my wrist. There was a small live current, so small I might have called it feeling. I took the coat and the walk. The town at that hour is a place where humanity practices its ordinary language. The grocer knew me and asked about my mother. The solicitor's clerk looked at me with the efficient sympathies of those who balance others' misfortunes. No one mentioned my missing things. That omission in itself felt like an omission of witness. I walked the route that curved past the old churchyard and then the little pond where children skittered in summer. I kept expecting the world to give back the contour of my life, a glove, a book, some small proof, but the streets held themselves like polite secrets. When I returned, the house had reset. A fire had been coaxed back into being. The kettle hummed in the kitchen as if in apology. On the hall table there was, impossibly, my coat folded in the exact way I folded it. The notebook lay on the armchair where I had always kept it, its leather closed like a mouth. For a short time, the house seemed to have done what houses do when a disturbance passes, mend the place and pretend nothing happened. I walked to the armchair and found the notebook warm as if someone had only just held it. My thumb slid beneath the cover. The last entry I remembered making, line after line of small, exact observations, was gone from the back of the book. In its place, neat and looping, was an entry dated that morning. It read, "Met the man who carries wood. He left coffee on the sill." For a moment I laughed at the absurdity of it. Then I took the page in both hands and lowered my face. The handwriting was mine, that precise elbow of an R, the particular way I dotted I's with a small flourish. Yet it had a false neatness. Letters finished in a place where my hand usually stuttered, a decisiveness I did not record. I walked then to the pool, the notebook clasped in my hand like a small defiant talisman. The surface was glass. When I leaned over, I saw not my face, but something arranged as my face, and it did not answer my breath. Around the stone rim, the night air gathered like a listener. The house had adopted the posture of a thing waiting to be spoken to. I became aware, suddenly, of a gap in the household's movements. There was a chair at the table where someone had sat, his crease in the upholstery still warm. I called out, first with humor, then with the insistence of someone who senses a wrong being confirmed. My voice carried through the rooms and returned to me smaller, a child's echo. "No," she said from behind me. I turned to find her at the conservatory doors, her hand on the brass. Her face was arranged in a way I had learned, precise with the same tenderness as a book opened at a certain page. "He is here," she said. We circled the house in that way people do when they are reluctant to ask a question out loud. The study, with the books aligned, offered only the faint evidence of being lived in. A jacket lay across the back of a chair in the guest room. No, 2 jackets. There was a hat on the hall stand that I did not own. It was not until I opened the kitchen pantry that I found one small, undeniable proof. My mother's biscuit tin, which she kept for reasons of sorrow and habit, stood ajar and emptied of every half-eaten biscuit. It was a tiny domestic crime that felt like sacrilege. The thing that took my place did so without spectacle. It arrived as a series of corrections. Light adjusted itself. The dog that belonged to a neighbor came and left without noticing. The postboy nodded like a man who had been given the outline of a person and filled it with habit. When he first stepped into the room where I stood, when he stepped into my field of witness, everyone else continued as if nothing had happened. It was only I who held the ledger open. He looked like me in a way that was both flattering and insulting. Not a forgery, but a draft. My posture, my hands, a certain suburban heft to the shoulders that belonged to years of work. At a distance, he might have been me in a photograph. Up close, the mimicry fissured in exact and maddening ways. He poured tea for my mother and set the cup down with a precision that was a fraction too precise. The tepidness of the beverage told me he had timed the pour by a clock no heart would know. He greeted the dog with the same absent affection as I did, but his fingers did not carry the smell of carriage oil the way mine do. A small, human field. He sat at the head of the table and laughed at my mother's jokes with the appropriate inflections. He kissed her with the kind of civility that a son-in-law reserves for onlookers, and his forehead did not wrinkle the way mine does when something pricks my mind. He accepted her thanks as if it were an accounting entry. When he rose, he walked like a man with the pattern of a house memorized down to the squeaks of the stairs. I watched and made for myself a list. The teacup left too little condensation. The half-smile contained none of the micro-pauses that make a person's laugh honest. He did not fumble the tablecloth for a childlike reason when he reached for the salt. He moved across the threshold without the small habitual pause before entering rooms that I always took. A pause that acknowledges the room as a thing that might object. He held my habit of reading the bills aloud and yet did not seem to take their weight into his chest. These omissions, I thought, were proof. I also noticed that he wore my ring, not on the finger I wore it, but on the other hand. It was a small and immediate wrongness, a ring turned an inch and given to the body in the wrong place. My fingers closed briefly, as though to reclaim their geography. When at last I spoke to him directly, I felt the ledger inside of me hope for an accounting that would make sense. "Who are you?" I asked. He looked at me with the sort of clarity I have always used on other men when I wanted them to reveal themselves. His voice was mine, but it carried the echo of an auditorium rather than the close intimacy of a kitchen. "I am here," he said. The sentence had the gravity of a note on a ledger. Settled, declarative. "Perhaps," my wife suggested, as if offering a gloss on a difficult sentence, "he is a version of what you were." It was not a lie wholly without truth. Things in our house rearranged themselves as if in obedience to her. Our new grammar developed a subject, her attention. The man who had my face but not my mistakes could exist in public because the city loved a perfected portrait. He could smile and for the sake of a charity photograph be precise. He could be the curated husband that answered to the social page. Those who passed him looked at him and saw nothing but the coalescence of decor. I attempted small tests. When he set my coffee down in the morning, I left the spoon in the cup, the handle resting at the left, a trivial and intimate choreography I had learned to correct over years. He moved the spoon to the right without hesitation. When my mother asked him gently about the solicitor's letter, he answered with a quotation I had used in the past and cited the page, his memory reading like a script. He could replicate knowledge but not the punctuation of lives. He mimed tenderness with a fidelity that made me ache, and yet there were omissions, little grave lacunae. One afternoon I asked him to tighten a loose knob on the old sideboard, a task that involves the kind of small, patient handwork I have performed for years. He took a screwdriver and worked methodically as if assembling a machine, turning screws exactly so but without the particular smallness of touch that leaves the wood humming in gratitude. The knob held. It did not creak. It did not remember hands in the corners of its grain. I felt a small and bitter envy for a thing as simple as a tightened screw. The social life resumed its gently humming negligence. Invitations arrived bearing our double name. Friends expressed concern with the courtesy of people who visit the sick. "Is he well? He is so different, so composed." They spoke as though composure were a virtue rather than a symptom. On the club terrace, a neighbor patted the replacement on the shoulder and discussed a hunting trip they had not actually taken. The man answered with the kind of decisive pronouncement you make when you have rehearsed a character enough to believe it. At night, when the house retired to its grammar of smallness, he would sit by the pool and watch the water as if it were a screen. Once, I found him there, his hands folded in his lap with a dignity I used to mistake for introspection. When I stepped close enough for him to look up, he turned his head with the measured slowness of someone who expects footprints to be noticed. His reflection in the pool obeyed him without the familiar lag. The world answered him as if it had known all along to which instrument to attune. There is a cruelty to these smallodities. They become evidence collected by a man who knows the weight of detail. Grief, which I had kept carefully buttoned, unfolded into a list of particulars accumulated to prove the presence of a person. If there is a science of loss, it is made of these particulars. The coffee left an inch too cool, a crossword square penned in with mechanical perfection, the ring rotated a fraction. They are the kind of things you trade for sentimental anecdotes in the journals people pass around at wakes. I confronted my wife in the library one evening, the house dim with the kind of light that makes truth feel like a cost to be paid. "Did you do this?" I asked, the "this" being the substitution, the erasure of my small errors, the filling of the ledger with a forger's neatness. She folded the new table napkin and smiled in that way that had once been only observation. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I watched." "There is a difference," I said sharply. "Between watching and allowing." She looked at me, and for the first time I saw her look like a woman who had been a spectator her whole life and had just discovered the shape of the thing she had watched. Her fingers toyed with the corner of the napkin, a small human gesture. "Watching is not always indifference," she replied. "Sometimes watching is preparation." "What are you prepared for?" I asked. "For whatever comes," she said. Her voice was leveled, the sort of voice people use when choosing between two unpleasant but necessary acts. "For the thing that will let us keep the house." The sentence was an admission and also a bargain. It implied agency in the omission, the choice to allow an alteration that aligned the household with the public's appetite for perfection. It suggested that within the economy of our life, something could be exchanged. The messy, accidental places of human touch for a pattern that would please the city and perhaps keep creditors at bay. I thought of my mother's ledger in the front row of the church, of accounts balanced and the way gratitude had come like a small, pragmatic relief. I thought then, with an ache that was both shame and clarity, that perhaps this was what the socialite had been rehearsing for all along, a life composed of gestures so neat they could be sold without difficulty. I do not pretend to have been wholly outraged. There was a part of me that welcomed the respite from old shame. The replacement moved through the house with the lightness of someone who has been given grace by a public that cares more for image than for particularity. My creditors paused in their calls. My mother slept without the small pulls of worry that had been her nightly companion. In the ledger of our lives, some debts were quietly deferred, but nothing in me was lessened by the convenience. If anything, the arrangement sharpened the edges of what I had become. I began to watch not only the replacement, but the shape he made of the room. He fit into the frame like a photograph. He did not disturb the grain. His tea was always the right temperature. The curtains drew themselves to the precise place to show the painting in its best light. He existed as a kind of maintenance, a living pattern that kept the facade of our arrangement intact. There were nights, however, when the house rebelled against the pattern. The candles leaned away from him with an indecent curiosity. The pool occasionally hesitated to answer his motion. Once, in a rare fissure of error, he misremembered a childhood tale my mother loved and told it with the wrong end. An inversion that made her eyes blink and close in a way that made me think of someone pressing their palms against a wound. She did not scold him. She simply corrected the detail, and the room contracted like a man returning his breathing to a pattern after running. The tests escalated into more deliberate acts. I began to place things where I knew the replacement would notice. A letter I had written and never sent, a photograph of myself with my late father, a small tool I had made in my youth and never showed anyone. He looked at these items with perfect politeness but no ownership. He could converse with visitors about the nuances of the club and the merits of the latest charity book with the ease of trained response. When I asked him about a fact only a man who had lived the small humiliations of my life would know, about the single time I had lost my temper and had to apologize at a public dinner, he recited the apology in the past tense, as though reading a script rather than living a memory. There was one test I had been avoiding, a cruel and tender thing I feared to set out like a trap. My mother had a small ritual she loved. Each night she placed a coin in a dish beside her bed as a small offering to some private superstition. She did it without ceremony and without asking. It was an inheritance of habit. One night, when the house felt like it held its breath, I approached that dish and whispered the names of the times I had been youngest, naming each error aloud until the room was full of them. Then, when the replacement entered the corridor, I waited to see whether he would understand the small language my mother had taught us. He paused, as if interpreting the coin for the photograph it might become. There was no recognition in his face, only the curious attention of someone who can appreciate the shape of a gesture without the spine beneath it. He picked up the coin and placed it back with precise motion, palming it as if to read the currency rather than a memory. At that moment I understood that the inhumanity was not an anatomical defect, but an absence of the ragged seam that a life stitches into itself. By then I had tried other methods. I sat across from him one afternoon and read aloud from the notebook, passages of embarrassment and tenderness written in a hand that was mine and that he could mimic but not own. He listened as if a man training for a role, nodding at the sentences that read like stage directions. I asked him a question meant to be cruel, to break the machine. "Do you dream of your father?" He answered, in a voice suited to an audience, that dreams were inconvenient things. He smiled. It was the wrong smile. The house itself began to react. At night, the chandelier would shiver. Panes in the east wing fogged as if someone had sighed too close to them. The pool, on certain nights, took back its obedience and cast up not a perfect face, but a ripple where the water hesitated between copying and refusing. Once I saw the replacement's reflection twist, as if trying on a different face and failing. The skin in the mirror trembled like a curtain moved by an unseen hand. It was at that pool one late hour, when fluted moonlight pulled its way across the limestone and the world smelled like salt and old paper, that the final test came. I stood with the notebook at my chest. She stood beside me, the weight of a decision in her posture. The replacement sat across on the opposite rim, hands folded, the polite absorption of someone who occupies space for the sake of appearance. I can make it stop, I told her, the ledger of my life made sharp by the heat of indignation. I can show you how to put the pieces back, how to summon the thing that belongs here. She looked at me in that way that had always been both kind and careful. What would you have me do? She asked. I thought, absurdly, of stories where names are called and things answer. I thought of sacrifices whispered in chimneys and the cost of threads pulled from garments. Name me, I said. Call me by what I was when you first saw me. Speak the faults. Do not call for the husband the city would like to keep. Call the one who loses things and mends them, who forgets to call the solicitor and who sometimes burns his own toast. Call the man who has a coin in his pocket and remembers. She raised a hand. And if I call that man, she said slowly, what will be required? The question had the sound of a hinge again, of a door that would open on one side or the other. You will have to accept that the house will look less tidy, I said. You will have to accept that some visitors will not stay, that some invitations may not arrive. You will have to break the pattern the city prefers. You will have to let things be human. Her fingers pressed against the stone rim, and I noticed, with a small and horrified joy, the way her nails made slight marks in the limestone. She looked at the water. The pool answered her with a pause that felt like a decision. Do you want me to call you back? She asked. The ledger in me wanted to say yes because I wanted to reclaim the proof of my life. Another part wanted to say no because I held a secret selfishness, to see whether the replacement might learn the small human errors and thereby become a kind of improvement I did not deserve. But the answer came from somewhere quieter than calculation. Yes, I said. She spoke my name like an inventory of delicate things. It hung on the air like a receipt. The pool took it and considered it, and for a moment, the world felt sharp enough to cut a coin. I held my breath the way one keeps a delicate thing from slipping. There was an absence then, a small domestic hollow. The replacement's head turned with the exactitude of a pendulum. His mouth moved as if to answer. The surface of the water caught his motion. The candle near us elongated as if listening. For a second, the house seemed to gather itself to hear. Then the pool shuddered and cast up a smear where my presence had been. The reflection was not the same. It wore the features of both but did not settle. The replacement staggered as if a knot had been pulled tight around him and then loosened. He put a hand to his chest, a theatrical gesture I had seen in plays, and then hesitated. The ring on his finger turned, came to rest at the correct place for a heartbeat, and then slid back to the wrong hand. My throat tightened. The house argued through its objects about which grammar to accept. The pool sent a ripple that did not echo the motion, but answered it with a new accent. A drop of water escaped the stone and fell into my palm with the coldness of early spring. We stood there, three of us, with the night as audience. The replacement's voice trembled for an instant and then settled into something like imitation. I remember, he said, and it was not clear whether he addressed the pool, my wife, or me. Do you? I asked. His eyes flicked to me. For a moment the man wore recognition like a garment that had been bruised in a suitcase. I remember the smell of coal in your coat, he said. I remember the way your mother speaks of debts as if they were saints. It was a curious litany of borrowed things. If memory is currency, he was trading in counterfeit bills, impeccably printed but without the watermark. My wife reached forward then, and with the simplest motion, one that has cost more in many stories than armies, she took his hand. Her fingers lay over his as if testing whether a living artery ran beneath. The replacement's hand was warm and obedient. He did not withdraw. There are choices set within the body that no ledger can anticipate. She could have released him then, and chosen the tidy life the city rewarded. She could have left him to the elegant emptiness he offered, and kept the public's attention. Instead, she did the small, ruinous thing. She moved her fingers and, with a tenderness I had taught myself by counting, she pressed the calluses at the base of his palm. It was not a theatrical cruelty. It was the touch of someone wanting to find a pulse. He flinched as a person might when first learning the lesson of being surprised by kindness. For a fragment of time, his manner softened into an imitation of embarrassment. The pool stilled in sympathy. "You must learn to make mistakes," she said, quiet as a confession. "You must learn to hold a cup and burn your fingers. You must learn to forget things and then remember them again. You must learn to be annoying, or else we will have won at the cost of what we loved." There was a smallness in that desire that made the house itself feel more human. The replacement's shoulders drooped as if the concept were heavy and pleasing. He looked at the cup in his hand and set it down and misaligned it by 2 inches on purpose. The act made his face crumple like a person testing a new emotion. The pool answered with a ripple that matched the timbre of a laugh. I did not know then whether he was learning or merely copying the shape of learning. I do not know now, in truth. All I can say with the ledger of my memory is that after that night, there were nights where the replacement poured the tea too hot, and other nights when he forgot the solicitor's letter. He made the wrong jokes and sometimes left his bootlaces untied. He learned the small human failures that stitch a life together, and with each one he became less perfect. The airflow of the house altered. It welcomed the fault lines. We did not lose everything. The city still came to the house for its photographs, and the ledger balanced more favorably when bills were due. My mother, who had once watched with the calculating eye of a creditor, called me by my childhood nickname in the pantry the other day and told me that she could sleep now. There are economies that are merciless in their demand for spectacle and economies that are merciful in their domestication of flaws. And yet the question remains, as present and as stubborn as a splinter: what had vanished and what had returned in its stead? Sometimes when I watch the replacement sit at the table and fumble with a spoon, when he misplaces a sock and laughs like a man embarrassed by triviality, I feel a righteous gratitude. Other times I feel, with the peculiar and awkward envy of intimate knowledge, the loss that comes from having your errors erased and then returned like a gift. I have kept my ledger. I continue to record the small wrongs and the restorations. I wrote one morning a list of things that prove a person is alive. A bruise remembered without theater. A coin pressed into a dish as habit. The inclination to answer a neighbor with honest annoyance when he leaves his card on the curb. It is not a perfect list. It cannot be. Nothing human is. There were moments of tenderness that approached redemption. Once, in summer, I watched him tie my mother's shoelace after she had tripped and seen his face flush with a clumsy concern he could not pretend. For once, the mimicry gave way to a stammer that felt like shame and perhaps like learning. He bent his head, and the crown of his temple caught the light we used for reading. He looked absurd and real. My wife watched him with an expression I could not name, a mixture of triumph and mercy. The candles leaned toward the sound of their small laughter, and for a heartbeat, the house itself seemed to relax. Not everything settled into that compromise. There remain nights when the pool answers late, when the mirror holds a pause like a swallowed word. There are times when the man who bears my face moves with such perfection in public that I feel the old trades, obligation, relief, the brittle gratitude of a man whose mother sleeps a little easier because the city smiles, arrange themselves into neat packages. I sometimes envy the neatness and sometimes despise the way it eases me of my ghosts. This is the shape of our agreement. We traded certain truths for the ability to breathe in the open air without immediate collapse. The cost was not paid in banners or in coin alone. It was paid in the calculus of authenticity, in the slippage of habit, in the reorientation of domestic grammar. My wife, who had been an observer and then a lover learning to be careless, made a choice that was both tender and pragmatic. She wanted to protect the house, to keep her mother safe, to keep the ledger from producing a penalty she could not bear. She chose the small inhuman thing that promised to keep the world tidy. There are people who, when told of such stories, insist upon a solution, a ritual, an exorcism of sorts, a final and grand undoing. I do not have such a thing to offer. The universe of our house seems not to respond to overtures like a cannon shot. It responds instead to a hand reaching and being answered by a hand that does not know how to tremble and learns to do so over time. The miracle, if there is one, is not that replacement becomes identical to original, but that it learns to be fallible. Sometimes, in the small hours, I am sitting at the kitchen table and I feel a tremble in my cup. It is human. It is the hand that holds it. The replacement has learned to let his fingers shake. He does it without calculation now, as if he has discovered that tremor is the currency of intimacy. My wife watches him with an expression that is always at once catalog and mercy. I watch too, and sometimes I am jealous and sometimes vertiginously grateful. If there is guilt in the arrangement, it rests in the knowledge that at some cost my mother and I sleep better. If there is grace, it is that the house has found a new grammar, one that tolerates mistakes. The pool still lags sometimes. The mirror still hesitates to answer the true movement. But there are mornings when I wake and find a note slipped into my notebook, a small line, perhaps my own handwriting altered by habit, that reads like an apology. I cannot tell with certainty who wrote it. This, then, is the state of us. A household kept tidy by a man who was not made to be messy, and a woman who learned the courage to prefer the raggedness of love over the polishing of image. I do not know whether the replacement will become wholly human, or whether he will always be an answered echo, learning to err in ways that make us love him. I am not the kind of prophet who tells the future. I am only a man who counts and who confesses. I can say that tenderness returned in small, unglamorous increments, spilled milk, an apologetic frown, a remembered name, and that these accrue to make a life that is possible to touch. The last thing I will tell you before the night folds into its ordinary smallness is this. The house will, in time, remember which grammar it prefers because houses remember the weight of hands as much as the shape of vows. Perhaps the pool will always lag a little. Perhaps the mirror will sometimes refuse to betray the truth. But once, in the late spring, my wife left a cup of tea to cool for precisely 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and the replacement knocked it over in the act of rescuing it, sending a warm, honest spill across the rug. He cursed, the wrong word in the wrong way for our drawing room, and then, with a sudden and wholly human shame, he bent and began to blot at the stain with his sleeve. My mother, who had watched those small repairs with the distant virtue of a woman who had paid off her own debts, made a sound like a laugh and crossed the room and helped him. The sound of them working together, that particular coalition of hands and commonness, was, for me, the proof I needed, not that the replacement was wholly my return, but that the house had at least become a place where mistakes could be made and remedied without the world turning away. So I keep the ledger and I watch the pool, and I collect the small wrongs and the small mercies. When I wake in the early hours, I sometimes reach for my notebook and find a line written in a hand almost mine that reads, "Learned to misplace a key." I smile and do not ask which man made the notation. The house hums with the sound of the ordinary, and at times, in the quiet where the world leans in, I think I can hear the faint echo of a man learning how to be human. What would you do if you found a mimic in your life, something that polished your shame and wore your face? Would you call back what was messy? Or would you keep the perfection and the ease?